She carved 47 marks into a post with her fingernail. One for each day her father locked her underground. One for each day she told herself someone would come, and called herself a fool for hoping. She had no light, no food worth naming, and no guarantee that the world above her still remembered she existed. But she had one thing her father never counted on. She had her mother's voice in her head. And her mother had never once told her to stop fighting. This channel is dedicated to the stories that live between the dust and the stars of the American West. Stories of love that survives grief, justice that arrives late but arrives, and the unbreakable bond between mothers and daughters across time. What this story leaves with you. Hope is not weakness. It is the most radical act of survival a person can choose in the dark. If this story moved something in you, subscribe, leave a comment, and share it, because some stories deserve more than one listener.
For 47 days, Nettie marked the passing time on a wooden post. Morning, midday, night. Her father, Harlan, had locked her down there to break her spirit, to force her to sign away the last piece of her mother's legacy. He'd show up smelling of whiskey, his shadow blocking the only light she ever saw, leaving a plate of hardtack and water on the dirt floor. He thought he was in control. He thought he was winning. One day he came in with a cold look in his eye. "Maeve Dunlap from the general store came by asking after you," he said. Nettie's heart jumped, but she kept her face as still as a stone. "I told her you were sick with a fever." "She believed it," he snarled, grabbing her chin. "She'll believe it as long as I say it, you understand?" Nettie stared right back at him. Looking away only made it worse. "I understand," she whispered. Then he pulled out a piece of paper. "I need you to sign this." "No," she said, the words small but solid. "I already signed over the land. You got what you wanted." Harlan's face tightened. "That was for the dirt, girl. This paper is for the water rights. Without 'em, that land is just dust. With 'em, it's the most valuable plot in the county." He thought he had her cornered, but he didn't know his own daughter. "That's why I will not sign it," Nettie said, her back pressed against the cool cellar wall. Harlan stared at her, his plan crumbling. In a cold fury, he snatched the plate of food from the floor and stormed out, the padlock clicking shut behind him. He left her in the dark, thinking hunger would be his ally. Little did he know, a good man named Josiah Crane was about to ride into town. Josiah had been a widower for a year, and the quiet mornings were his only comfort. He was heading to Abilene for fencing wire when he stopped at Maeve Dunlap's store. "Morning, Josiah," Maeve said, not beating around the bush. "You ride past the Calloway place?" Josiah shook his head. "Something's wrong out there," she said, her voice low. "Harlan keeps saying his girl Nettie is sick. Been sick for 7 weeks. I knew her mother, Ruth. That girl doesn't get sick like that. She has a father who won't let her out of the house." Josiah didn't want any trouble, he just wanted his wire. "Maeve, that's not my business." "You knew Ruth," Maeve said, and that stopped him cold. He remembered Ruth Calloway bringing him soup after his wife passed, sitting on his porch in comforting silence. She was a good woman. "Harlan is drowning in gambling debts," Maeve continued. "And Ruth left that girl 40 acres, plus the water rights. You do the math." He knew she was right. So Josiah loaded up his wire, tipped his hat, and rode south toward the Calloway place. The ranch looked abandoned. Fences were down, and weeds choked what was once a beautiful garden. As he got closer, he heard a faint sound coming from the ground behind the house. He found the root cellar with a heavy padlock on the door, a padlock in the middle of summer. "Hello," he called out. A shaky voice answered from inside. "Who's there?" "Name's Josiah Crane. Maeve Dunlap sent me." There was a sound that might have been a sob. "My father is in town," the voice said, growing stronger. "The key is hanging on a nail inside the kitchen, right above the stove." Josiah did not hesitate. He walked into the house, found the key exactly where she said it was, and came back. The lock opened with a loud crack. He lifted the heavy door, and the sunlight poured in. There was Nettie, pale and thin, but with a fire in her eyes that Harlan had failed to extinguish. Her wrists had old scars from when he'd tied her up. "How long have you been down here?" Josiah asked, his voice thick with anger. 47 days, she said. And in that moment, Josiah Crane knew he was not the kind of man who could unsee something like this. He helped Nettie out of that cellar and took her straight to the sheriff's office in Abilene. When Harlan Calloway stumbled home that night, drunk and broke from the card tables, he found the cellar door wide open. The law was waiting for him on the porch. He lost everything: the land he'd stolen, his freedom, and the last bit of respect anyone might have had for him. Nettie, with the help of Josiah and Maeve, took back her mother's farm. She worked the land, and with those precious water rights, she made it thrive. Josiah found a reason to live again, helping her rebuild. They showed the whole county that greed will rot a man to his core, but the strength of a good heart and good neighbors can overcome even the darkest of evils. And that's a truth as solid as the Texas ground we stand on. The dress was faded and torn, probably the same one she had on when he threw her in that cellar, but her eyes were clear. That is what he would remember. Everything else on her was broken, but her eyes were steady and clear as a blue norther. He asked, "Can you stand up?" She rose on her own, swaying just once before catching her balance on the damp wall. Josiah held out a hand to help. She stared at it a long moment before taking it, her grip surprisingly firm. As she stepped into the blinding sun, Nettie spoke. "My father forced me to sign over my mother's land. He locked me down there and swore I would not see the sun again until my name was on that deed." Josiah's voice was low. "Did you sign it?" "I signed for the land," she said, looking him square in the eye. "But I did not sign away the water rights. That is why I was still in that hole. He will tell you I am crazy. He will tell everyone. Some will believe him because it is always easier to believe a man than a locked door." Josiah looked at her face. She was not asking for help. She was telling him the lay of the land. "Can you ride a horse?" he asked. "I can ride." "Then we are leaving this place." He helped her onto his horse, Slate, and pulled himself up behind her. The horse shifted but held steady under their combined weight. Josiah pointed him toward the main road. "He will come for me," Nettie said, her voice even, but her body tense against him. "I reckon he will. He has friends, men who owe him favors. I reckon that too." "Then why are you doing this for me?" Josiah rode on for a spell before he answered. "Because I did not help a woman once before, and she ended up buried in an unmarked grave outside Wichita." Nettie said nothing. There was nothing to say. An hour later, they reached Josiah's ranch. It had a solid fence, a good barn, and a lonely-looking house. He helped her down and drew a cup of fresh water from the well. "You can have the house," he said. "I will sleep in the barn." "You do not have to do that." "I know," he said. "There is a lock on the bedroom door. It bolts from the inside. The key is on the dresser. You keep it." Something in her expression changed then. It was not gratitude. It was the look of a person who finally felt seen. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me yet," Josiah warned. "When your father learns where you are, things will get harder before they get easier." Nettie turned back to the well. "There is something else you need to know," she said. "The water rights my mother filed, they control the irrigation for 3 big ranches downstream. That includes Judge Puit's land." She faced him. "My father does not just want the money. He wants power over the judge, over the whole county." Josiah let the weight of her words sink in. If her father controlled the water, he controlled everything. "That," Nettie said, her voice like cold steel, "is why he locked me in a cellar for 47 days. I am the only one standing in his way." Josiah looked at her then, at the rope burns on her wrists and the grit in her eyes. and he understood. This was not a rescue. This was the start of a war. "We will need Maeve," he said, "and the sheriff, and proof that deed was signed under threat." "My mother kept a journal," Nettie said, a small surprise in her voice. "She wrote about my father, about his drinking." "Where is this journal?" "Hidden," she said. "Under the floorboard. It's in my room. He has no idea it exists." "Your mother was smart to hide it." "My mother did not hide it," Nettie said. "I did, 3 years ago." Josiah just stared at her. She had been preparing for this fight for a long, long time. "You knew this day was coming," he said quietly. "I prayed it would not," she answered, finally letting her shoulders slump with exhaustion. She sat on the porch step. "But my mother taught me to hope for the best and prepare for a man at his worst." Josiah sat on the step near her, leaving a respectful space between them. "First thing in the morning, I will ride into Abilene and find Maeve. Then we will see Sheriff Briggs. Briggs plays cards with my father." "I know," Josiah said, "but even he cannot ignore what has been done to you. A locked cellar and rope marks tell their own story." Nettie unconsciously rubbed her wrists. "He will say I did it to myself." "Did you?" he asked. Her eyes flashed with fire. "No!" "Then we will let the marks speak for themselves." A lone coyote called out from the hills, and Nettie flinched just for a second. Josiah saw it but did not say a word. Instead he asked, "Are you hungry?" He went inside and came back with bread, salted pork, and a jar of peach preserves his late wife Sarah had made. He had never had the heart to open them before now. Nettie ate slowly, as if she were learning to trust food again. She spoke of her mother between bites. "She was the strongest person I knew," Nettie said. "She married my father back when he was a good man before the war changed him. She believed he could change back. She was wrong about that." "What was she right about?" Josiah asked. "That land is the only thing a woman can truly own. That is why she put those water rights in her name. She saw the man he was becoming." Josiah poured her more water. "Your mother, Ruth, was a good woman. She brought soup to my house after my wife passed away. She just sat on this porch with me for an hour and did not say a single word. It was the best conversation I had that entire year." A small smile touched Nettie's lips. "That sounds just like her." They sat in a comfortable silence as the sun went down. Then Nettie's voice turned hard. "My father will be home by now. He will find the cellar empty. He will not come tonight. First he will drink. Then by morning he will have a story prepared. He will paint himself as the worried father," she continued, "and me as the ungrateful, unstable daughter. Half the town will believe him. You know him well." "I have had 47 days with nothing to do but study him," she said, setting her plate down. "He will come here and he will bring men. He learned a long time ago that ink on paper can hurt worse and last longer than a man's fist." Josiah leaned forward. "Then we had better have our own paper ready." "The journal," Nettie breathed. She looked around at his ranch, at the life he had built. "Why did Maeve send you? Why you specifically?" "I'm not sure." "I think I know," Nettie said, meeting his gaze. "She sent you because you are the one man in this county who already lost someone you could not protect. She knew you would not be able to walk away a second time." Josiah felt a knot tighten in his chest. He did not answer, because she was right. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rough. "Lock the door. I will be in the barn." Nettie stood and paused at the doorway. "Josiah," she said, "I counted 47 sunrises down there. Every morning I told myself someone would come. Every night I told myself I was a fool for hoping." She looked back at him. "I was not a fool." He heard the solid click of the lock turning from the inside. Imagine being locked in a dirt cellar for 47 days by your own kin. That was Nettie Calloway's life, until Josiah broke her out. Now they were about to ride back into Abilene and face down the man who did it. Her father, Harlan. Because sometimes you have to fight for what is right, even if it feels like you are fighting all alone. As dawn broke, Josiah woke with a start, grabbing his rifle. But it was only Nettie standing there on the porch with 2 tin cups of coffee. She stood taller than the day before, like a wildflower pushing up through hard-packed dirt. He took the cup. "You get any sleep?" he asked. "More than I have in weeks," she said. That lock on the door helped. The coffee was strong enough to peel paint, but Josiah did not say a word. "We need to ride into Abilene," Josiah told her. "We will talk to Maeve first, then the sheriff." Nettie's face tightened. "Sheriff Briggs will not help us. My father does not just play cards with him, he owns him." She explained that Harlan held a $300 gambling marker over the sheriff's head. It meant Briggs was on her father's leash. The whole situation just got a lot heavier. "Then we start with Maeve," Josiah said. "She will know who else to trust." "Judge Pruitt," Nettie said suddenly. "My father is trying to take my water rights, but they are still in my name. My mother made sure of that. If we can get to the judge before my father does, he will have to listen to us." They rode north toward Abilene, with Nettie watching the road for any sign of her father. An hour later, they reached Dunlap's general store. Maeve Dunlap was sweeping the steps. She stopped, put her hands on her hips, and watched them get off their horses. Her eyes went from Josiah to Nettie, lingering on the raw, red scars around the girl's wrists. Maeve's face did not soften. It turned to stone. "Get inside," Maeve said, her voice low and serious. "Both of you. Now." She locked the door behind them and flipped the sign to closed. Her son Levi, a tall young man with his mother's sharp eyes, came downstairs and stopped dead when he saw Nettie. "Levi, put some water on to boil," Maeve ordered. "And bring me the kit from under the counter." "I'm all right," Nettie said, but Maeve was having none of it. "You are not all right. Sit down." Nettie sat. Maeve Dunlap was the kind of woman you just did not argue with. Maeve worked without a word, gently cleaning the rope burns. The kindness in her hands was a stark contrast to the fury in her eyes. "How long?" Maeve finally asked. 47 days, Nettie whispered. "In the root cellar, padlocked." Maeve's hands stopped for a second. "I went to that house 3 times, she said, her voice thick with anger. "He lied to my face every time. I should have pushed harder." From the counter, Levi's voice was quiet but firm. "What do you need?" He was looking right at Nettie. "I need my mother's journal," Nettie said. "It is hidden under the floorboards in my old room." She explained that her mother had written everything down, every threat, every drunken rage, from the time her father started drinking until the week she passed away. It was proof. It was everything. The room was dead silent. "Briggs will not help," Maeve said. "But Judge Pruitt is a fair man. If we show him that journal, he will listen." "I will go get it," Nettie said, her voice stronger now. "No," Josiah and Maeve said at the same time. "He will be watching the house for you." "But I am the only one who knows where to find it," Nettie insisted. "She is right," Levi said from the counter. "But she does not have to go by herself." "I am going with her," Levi said. And when Maeve looked at her son, she saw a resolve that she could not argue with. "Go through the creek bed," Maeve instructed. "Harlan watches the road, not the water." Nettie looked at Levi. "Are you sure about this?" "My mother feels guilty for not pushing past your father's door," Levi said. "I am not going to spend my life feeling the same way." They left through the back of the store. Josiah turned to Maeve. "He is young." "He is old enough to know right from wrong," Maeve replied, untying her apron. "And you need to get to Judge Pruitt. You will find him at the hotel dining room at noon sharp. You make sure he hears about those rope burns before Harlan can tell him any lies. This is not just about Nettie anymore, Josiah. This is about our town." Josiah had 20 minutes, and he used every second to figure out what to say. Judge Pruitt was a man who liked things precise. He had no patience for emotion or pleading in his courtroom, just facts and law. Josiah didn't have much on paper, only rope burns on a young woman's wrists and her word against her own father. He found Judge Pruitt right where Maeve said, at a corner table with roast beef and the Abilene Chronicle. At 60 years old, Samuel Pruitt had a neatly trimmed white beard and eyes that had seen every kind of lie. "Judge Pruitt," Josiah said. The judge looked up. "Mr. Crane, I don't believe we have business." "We do now, sir." "Well, sit down then. But this better be worth my lunch." Josiah sat and laid the story out plain. No fluff, no drama. He told him about the cellar, the padlock, the rope marks, and the 47 days. He explained how the land deed was signed under threat and about the water rights Harlan was trying to claim. He spoke Pruitt's language: facts, sequence, evidence. The judge just listened, cutting his beef into perfect squares. When Josiah finished, Pruitt placed his fork down. "Are you telling me Harlan Calloway locked his grown daughter in a cellar to force a land deal?" "Yes, sir." "And this land includes water rights filed by his late wife, Ruth?" "Yes, sir." "Water rights that, if I recall, supply several downstream properties." Pruitt stopped for a moment. "Including my own?" "Yes, sir." The judge folded his napkin. "That's a conflict of interest, Mr. Crane." "I know that. But the other choice is letting that girl go back in the cellar." "Has a complaint been filed with the sheriff?" "Not yet. Sheriff Briggs owes Harlan a gambling debt, $300. Pruitt's eyes got sharp. "You're sure about that?" "The girl told me. She heard plenty through the cellar walls these last 47 days. Pruitt leaned back, quiet for a long spell. "I can't rule on this myself, not without a full disclosure. But I can send it to the circuit judge in Salina. And I can issue a temporary order to stop any property transfer until this is sorted out." "How soon?" "I can draft it this afternoon. The imprisonment is a criminal matter for the sheriff. If Briggs won't do his job, the U.S. Marshal will." Josiah nodded. "There's one more thing. Her mother kept a journal. Years of records detailing the abuse. They're getting it right now." "From where?" "The Calloway house." A single eyebrow went up on the judge's face. "That's a bold move." "The girl insisted." "I bet she did," Pruitt said, picking up his fork again. "Bring me that journal, Mr. Crane, and bring me the girl. I want to hear this story from her." He ate a piece of beef. "I've known Harlan Calloway for 15 years. I've watched him go downhill since the war. Always figured it was his business. Looks like I was wrong." As Josiah left, the judge called out, "Don't thank me. I'm just doing my job. Someone should have made me do it a long time ago." Josiah rode hard back to the Calloway place. Maeve had told him to stay put, but a bad feeling was sitting in his gut, the kind a man gets when he's sent someone else to do his dirty work. A mile out, he heard yelling. He spurred his horse, Slate, into a gallop. He saw Harlan on the porch, a shotgun resting over his arm. Levi stood in the yard, hands up. Behind him, Nettie clutched a leather book to her chest. They'd gotten the journal, but Harlan had caught them. "That's mine," Harlan hollered, pointing at the book. "She is stealing from my house." "She is taking what her mother left her," Levi said, his voice steady. "Put the gun down, Mr. Calloway. You're Maeve Dunlap's boy. Should have known she'd be sniffing around. Get off my land." "Not without Nettie." Harlan snapped the shotgun shut. Levi didn't move, but his hands trembled just a bit. Nettie stepped out from behind him. "Father." Harlan's eyes fixed on her with a look that wasn't anger, but something uglier. Ownership. "You come on home," he said, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "Come home now, and we'll forget this happened. I will even unlock the cellar. You can have your old room back." "You will unlock the cellar," Nettie repeated, her voice full of disbelief. "You say that like it's some kind of gift. Like 47 days in the dark can be fixed with one night in a bed." "I was keeping you safe." "You kept me a prisoner." Harlan's voice cracked. "You think folks out there are kind? They will use you up and throw you away. I am the only one who... You chained me. You starved me. You made me sign away Mama's land. That is family land. It's my land. Mama left it to me. To me. The air was thick with tension. Harlan took a step off the porch. Just then, Josiah rode into the yard, slow and deliberate, stopping his horse right between them. He didn't say a word, just let his presence settle things. "Harlan," Josiah said calmly. "You," Harlan spat. "You broke into my cellar and stole my daughter." "I opened a door for a woman who wanted to walk through it. There is a difference. She is not a woman. She is 22 years old, Harlan. She is a property owner whose father forged her signature on a deed." "Forged?" Harlan let out a nasty laugh. "She signed it herself. I reckon we'll see what Judge Pruitt thinks. He's expecting us this afternoon." The judge's name hit Harlan like a physical blow. His face went pale. "Pruitt has no business here." "He does when the water rights from that land feed his own ranch. He is already drafting an order to freeze the whole deal." Harlan's grip on the shotgun tightened. "You're just a fence mender, Crane. You have no idea what you're messing with." "I know what 47 tally marks on a cellar wall look like. And I know what a mother's journal filled with years of entries looks like to a judge who values evidence." Harlan stared at the journal in Nettie's arms, his eyes wide with shock. "Ruth didn't..." "Every single day, Father," Nettie said. "Every bruise, every threat. She wrote it all down. She even named witnesses. She hid it where you would never find it." Harlan's arm went limp, the shotgun hanging uselessly by his side. For a brief second, Josiah saw the man Harlan might have been before whatever broke inside him took over. "Give me that book," Harlan pleaded, all the fire gone from his voice. "Nettie, please." "No, I am your father." "You stopped being my father the first time you locked that cellar door and walked away." Harlan's chin trembled. He looked from Josiah to Levi and back to his daughter. He was outnumbered. "This is not over," he muttered. "You are right," Nettie said. "It is not. But the part where I do what you say, that part is over for good." Josiah reached down, offering Nettie his hand. She took it and swung up behind him on Slate. Levi got on his horse and they turned toward the road. Harlan just stood in his yard watching them ride away. He didn't yell, he didn't follow. He just seemed to get smaller and smaller in the distance. For the first time in 47 days, Nettie didn't look back. They rode into Abilene, the silence between them not from fear, but from knowing everything was about to change. Maeve was waiting for them. She saw the journal in Nettie's hands, and her own hand flew to her mouth. "Ruth's journal," she whispered. "Every page," Nettie told her. "Pruitt is waiting for us," Josiah said, turning to Levi. "What happened out there?" "Harlan had a shotgun," Levi said simply. "He did not use it." Maeve just looked at her son. For just a second. Then Maeve pulled him into a hug so fierce and quick it said everything a mother could not say out loud. Levi allowed it for 3 whole seconds before he pulled away, clearing his throat. "Time to go see the judge," he said. The 4 of them headed for the hotel. Josiah and Nettie walked up front, with Maeve and Levi right behind them. Folks took notice. In a little town like Abilene, 4 people marching toward the hotel in the middle of the day was louder than a cannon shot. A fellow named Carl Ducker, who drank with Harlan on Saturdays, stopped on the boardwalk to watch them go by. He kept his mouth shut, but Josiah saw him turn and head for the saloon, where Harlan was likely holding court. "Well, there goes our element of surprise," Josiah grumbled. "We never had it," Nettie answered. "In this town, news travels faster than the truth." They found Judge Pitt in his room, already writing out the temporary order. He stood up when they came in, his eyes finding Nettie right away. "Miss Calloway," he said, "please, sit down." He motioned to the chairs. "I have some questions, and I will need honest answers. Not brave ones, just the plain truth. Can you give me that?" "Sir, I have been honest my whole life," she replied. "That is why I just spent 47 days in a cellar." Judge Pitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat, picked up his pen, and said, "Tell me everything, from the very beginning." Nettie spoke for 40 minutes straight. She did not cry or hesitate. She told him about the first time her father bolted the cellar door and the rope he used to tie her to an iron ring. She talked about the 3 meals a day that turned into 2, then 1, then nothing at all. She described the deed he slid in front of her on day 12 and the water rights papers he brought on day 30. She told him how she refused to sign and what he did to her after that. She explained the marks on the wooden post, one for each day, scratched with her own fingernail. Puit wrote it all down. When she was done, he asked for the journal. Nettie gave it to him. He opened it and read the first page in silence, then shut the book. "Every entry is dated," he noted. "And these names, most of these people still live in Abilene. Maeve is in here. So are Dr. Hensley and Reverend Pike. I will need to speak with them." He placed the journal on his desk. "Miss Calloway, I am issuing a temporary restraining order against your father. The deed transfer will be put on hold until a full hearing. As for the criminal charges, I will contact Sheriff Briggs. If he does not act within 48 hours, I will call the United States Marshal myself." The judge paused. "You need to know, your father will fight this. He will hire lawyers and call in every favor he is owed. This will not be easy." "Pain is 47 days in a dark cellar," Nettie said. "This is just ink on paper." Judge Puit almost cracked a smile. "You sound just like your mother." "I will take that as the highest compliment, sir." They left the hotel as the sun began to dip low in the sky. Maeve walked close to Nettie, a steadying hand on her arm. Levi took her other side while Josiah watched the street from behind. They were halfway to the store when Sheriff Briggs appeared from an alleyway. He stood blocking the boardwalk, his arms crossed over his chest. "Miss Calloway," the sheriff said, "your father filed a complaint. Says you were taken from his house against your will." "He means against his will," Nettie shot back. "Not mine." The sheriff shifted his considerable weight. "He says you are not well, that you have been having episodes." "He says a lot of things," Nettie said, holding up her bandaged wrists for him to see. "Did he mention the rope burns? Did he mention 47 days, Sheriff?" Briggs glanced at her wrists. For a second, something like concern showed in his eyes, but it vanished quick. "I need to hear both sides of the story." "Then you can hear my side right now. Right here. This is not the place. Judge Puit already heard the case. He is putting a stop to the property sale. You can take my statement now, or you can explain to the circuit judge why you did not." Briggs's face turned 3 shades of red. He glared at Josiah. "You did this." "I just opened a door," Josiah said. "You stuck your nose in a family business. A locked cellar is not family business. It is a crime." Briggs looked up and down the street as the whole town watched from their windows and porches. "Come to my office," Briggs finally said. "I will take the statement." "And make the arrest?" Maeve asked. Briggs ignored her and walked toward the jail. Inside his office, Nettie gave her statement, every word clear and sharp. Briggs wrote it all down, his pen heavy. "I will ride out to the Calloway place tonight," he said when she was done. "To arrest him?" Nettie asked. Briggs looked right at her. "To talk to him." "Talk?" Nettie's voice was cold. "You are going to talk to the man who locked his daughter in a cellar for 7 weeks. I need to hear his side. You already know his side. You play cards with him every Saturday night." The room fell silent. Briggs' face went hard as stone. "That has got nothing to do with this. $300 says it does." Briggs shot up from his chair. "You watch yourself, girl." Josiah took 1 step forward. "Just one. She is a witness giving a statement in your office, Sheriff. You might want to remember that." Briggs stared Josiah down, then sank back into his chair. "I will ride out tonight." They all left the office as the sun set. As Nettie stepped outside, she froze. Harlan Calloway was standing across the street. He was not drunk or angry. He was clean-shaven in a good coat, standing next to a man in a suit. "That is Emmett Slade," Maeve whispered. "A lawyer from Salina. Harlan already hired help. Harlan looked at Nettie, gave a tiny tip of his hat, then walked into the saloon with Slade. The four of them were left standing there with a piece of paper, a journal, and the cold feeling that Harlan Calloway was playing a much bigger game. "He is not fighting like a drunk anymore," she said, her voice low. "No," Josiah agreed. "He is not." Slade moved like lightning. By morning, a new story was all over Abilene. Harlan Calloway was not a monster, but a heartbroken father. He was a war veteran pushed too far by a daughter who had gone mad with grief. Josiah heard it all from Pete Holm, a young man from the livery. "Folks are talking, Mr. Crane," Pete said. "Mr. Slade told everyone Harlan was just trying to get his daughter help. He says she hurts herself. And people believe that?" Pete looked at his boots. "Some do. It is an easier story to swallow." Josiah paid the boy and went to the barn. Nettie was brushing one of the horses, keeping her hands busy. "Slade is already talking," Josiah told her. "I know. He is telling them I am crazy. He is telling them a story that makes my father look like a good man. That is the story my father has been telling for years. Slade just put it in a fancy suit." She leaned against the horse. "Does Pete believe it?" He looked uncomfortable. "That means he halfway believes it. Slade now has a town full of men who would rather believe a father than a daughter." Josiah leaned on the stall. "Judge Puig's order went through. The property is frozen. That will not stop Slade. He will just move the whole case to a judge in Selena who has never met me or my mother. You think he is that good? My father hired him for a reason. Harlan Calloway is a drunk, but he is not a fool. That is what makes him so dangerous." She was thinking 3 steps ahead. "What do we do?" "We have to get to the people in my mother's journal before Slade does. The doctor, the reverend, our old neighbor. If Slade quiets them, that journal is just a dead woman's words against a lawyer. Then we ride now." Nettie shook her head. "Not we. Me and Maeve. The doctor will not talk about this with a man. He needs to hear it from a woman who makes him feel he can still do the right thing." Josiah saw she was right. "What about me?" "Go to Judge Puig. Tell him Slade is twisting the story. Ask him to move up the hearing. The longer we wait, the more time Slade has." They rode to Abilene and split up. Nettie went to find Maeve, and Josiah went to the hotel. Puig's door was locked. A note was pinned to it. "Court business in Selena. Return Thursday." Thursday, 4 days from now. Josiah felt the ground give way beneath him. Puig was gone, Slade was working, and Harlan Calloway had 4 days to do as he pleased. He ran to Maeve's store. Nettie and Maeve were inside with the journal. Levi stood watch at the window. "Puig is gone to Selena," Josiah said. "He left this morning. The note says Thursday." "That is not a coincidence," Nettie said, looking at Maeve. "Slade pulled Judge Puig out of town on purpose. All he needed was to file some paperwork that required the judge's presence. Even a worthless motion buys him 4 days. Nettie leaned hard on the counter. 4 days! That is all Slade needs to prove I am crazy. If he can get some doctor to sign off on that before the hearing, the deed transfer is final. My signature is good, and anything I say is just the rambling of a troubled girl." A chill went through the room. Maeve shook her head. "He cannot get a doctor to do that. Hensley has known you your whole life." Nettie replied, "Slade does not need Hensley. He just needs a doctor willing to take his money, and there are plenty of those in Selena and Topeka. Levi called it what it was, corruption. Nettie just called it Kansas." Maeve stood up straight. "Then we are not waiting. We go get witness statements right now before Slade can get to them." Nettie nodded. "First Dr. Hensley, then Reverend Pike, and last Mrs. Aldrich." "I will go with you to Hensley's," Maeve offered. "Josiah, you and Levi go find Mrs. Aldrich. She is old and scared, but she knows what she heard." With a plan set, they split up. Josiah and Levi went east, while Maeve and Nettie walked toward Dr. Hensley's office. It was above the apothecary. When Nettie knocked, she heard footsteps, and then the door creaked open. Dr. Thomas Hensley, a thin man with glasses, looked out at her. His face shifted from surprise to a kind of deep worry. "Nettie Calloway. Dr. Hensley, can we come in?" He paused for just a moment too long before stepping aside. "I heard you were staying with Josiah Crane," he said, not quite looking at her. "Your father was here yesterday. Said you had another one of your episodes." My father locked me in a root cellar for 47 days. Nettie's voice was steady. I know what he told you. I am telling you what really happened. She held out her wrists, still bandaged. These are from a rope tied to an iron ring, not from some spell of sadness. Hensley just stared. I treated your mother once, he said softly. She told me she fell. She did not fall, and you knew it. But you wrote down what she said and did not ask any more questions. The doctor's hands trembled as he took off his glasses to clean them. That is a fair thing to say. It is not an accusation, doctor. It is a fact. I am here to give you a chance to do for me what you could not do for my mother. Maeve spoke up then. We need you to write it down, Thomas. What you saw when you treated Ruth, and if you truly believe she just fell. If I write that, I am calling Harlan Calloway a liar. That has a price in this town. The price for not writing it, Maeve shot back, is this girl goes back into that cellar. Ruth is gone, Thomas, but Nettie is right here. You need to pick which one of them you can still save. Dr. Hensley put his glasses back on, sat down at his desk, and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I treated Ruth Calloway 3 times, he began. The injuries were not from falling. He looked up at Nettie. Is that enough? She shook her head. Dates. Details. Everything you can remember. He nodded and started to write. Meanwhile, Josiah and Levi were knocking on Mrs. Aldrich's door. She was a stooped, white-haired woman of 72 who barely opened it. Mrs. Aldrich, I am Josiah Crane, and this here is Levi Dunlap. I know who you are, she said. Maeve's boy. She looked right at Levi. Did your mother send you about Nettie? Yes, ma'am, he answered. That was all it took. The door swung open. I was wondering when someone would finally come ask me about that. Inside, she told them, I heard her screaming that first night. For 47 nights, I told myself it was just some animal. I counted every single one because I knew it was not. I was just too old and too afraid to do a thing about it. Tears streamed down her face. What is it you need from me? A written statement, Josiah said gently, about what you heard, and for how long. I will write it, she said, her voice firm. I will sign it, and I will swear on it to the judge and to God himself. I owe that girl. By midday, they had 3 signed statements. The third was from Reverend Pike, who confirmed he had once seen Harlan strike Ruth. He never reported it. He just prayed on it. Nettie's jaw tightened when she heard that. He watched my father hit my mother, and all he did was pray. He is willing to testify now, Maeve said, because it is safe, because he does not have to stand up all by himself. Nettie folded the papers carefully. I am not grateful. These people all watched my family break apart and did nothing because it was easier. Maeve put a hand on her shoulder. Late courage is still courage, Nettie. Tell that to my mother, she answered, and a heavy silence filled the air. That afternoon, they gathered around the counter in Maeve's store. We have enough to take to the circuit, Judge, Nettie said, her voice clear and sure. But we have to get there before Slade can file his motion. What if he already has? Levi asked. It takes at least 2 days to get a doctor's signature, even a crooked one. So we have 2 days, Josiah figured. Less, Nettie corrected. My father is smart. Slade is probably already on his way to Selena. The doctor will just sign off based on whatever lies Slade tells him. I will not even be in the room when they decide I have lost my mind. They can do that without even seeing you? Levi asked, shocked. All it takes is a doctor's opinion and a family member's testimony. It is a loophole big enough to drive a wagon straight through. Maeve slammed her hand down on the counter. Then we will drive our own wagon through it first. We take these statements to Selena ourselves, right now. We file them before Slade can. And we demand any examination be done by a doctor of Nettie's choosing. Can we do that? Josiah wondered. I do not know, Nettie admitted. But showing up with proof is a whole lot better than sitting here and waiting. Then we ride for Selena in the morning, Josiah declared. Tonight, Nettie corrected him. We ride tonight. If Slade has a 2-day head start, we cannot afford to lose a single hour. Josiah looked at her, seeing the pure will that had kept her sane for 47 days in the dark. Tonight, he agreed. They spent the next 2 hours getting ready. Maeve packed food while Levi tended to the horses. Josiah loaded up the wagon. Nettie sat at the counter and wrote. She was making a list of every single gambling debt her father owed, every name, every amount. For 7 weeks, she had listened through the cellar walls, and she had remembered it all. "How do you know all this?" Josiah asked. "My father talks to himself when he drinks," she explained without looking up. "He would sit right above the cellar and list out all his debts. I could not write them down, so I burned every last one into my memory. Every name, every number." She finally set her pen down. "My father thought that cellar made me helpless. He never imagined it would make me dangerous." Maeve came out with a bag for the trip and saw the list. "What is that?" "Insurance," Nettie said. They left Abilene as the sun went down, Nettie sitting beside Josiah in the wagon, with Maeve and Levi following on horseback. The road to Salina was 40 miles of hard prairie, and they planned to ride straight through the night. Josiah kept his eyes forward as Levi spoke. "Got a rider about a half-mile back. Just the one, moving fast, matching their speed like a shadow." "It ain't your father," Levi said. "Horse is too small." Josiah figured it was Slade, or a man Slade sent to watch them. He pulled the wagon to a stop, and so did the rider. Under a sky filled with stars, Nettie spoke up. "We keep moving. Let him follow. I'd rather face a man who knows I'm coming than sneak around." Josiah looked at her in the dim light. "You've been turning this over for a while." 47 days is a long while," she answered. They pushed on. Levi dropped back to get a better look and came back with a name. "It's Carl Ducker from the livery. He's on Slade's payroll now." Maeve chimed in. "Ducker's harmless." "No man's harmless when the price is right," Nettie replied. Around midnight, they stopped at a creek to water the horses. Josiah watched Nettie cup water from the creek. "You ought to get some sleep," he said. "Can't," she replied. "You're the one who needs to be sharp in Salina." "I'm always sharp. That's not pride. It's just how you stay alive." She stood and wiped her hands on her skirt. "Josiah," she said quietly, "why did your wife pick that chestnut mare?" The question surprised him. Sarah always said the horse had kind eyes. She was right, too. Copper was the first animal that didn't pull away when I touched her. Nettie paused. "Your wife sounds like she saw things clear." "She was good at everything," he said. After a moment, Nettie added, "I'm sorry you lost her." "I'm sorry you lost your mother." They stood there, two people who knew the deep ache of loss. Levi came out of the dark. "Ducker's made camp a quarter-mile back. He's done for the night." "He doesn't need to follow," Nettie said. "He already knows where we're headed." They reached the outskirts of Salina as the sun was coming up. Nettie woke with a start when a wheel hit a rut. "How far?" she asked, instantly awake. "We're close," Josiah told her. "We'll be there before the courthouse opens." She smoothed her dress, the same one she'd worn for 47 days. Maeve had offered her another, but Nettie had refused. "I want the judge to see what this looks like," she'd said. They parked the wagon, and the four of them stood on the courthouse steps. "Before we go in," Nettie said, "I need you all to know this was my choice. No one made me do this. My mother left me something worth fighting for, and I'd rather lose in that courtroom than win by staying silent." "You're not going to lose," Levi told her. "You can't promise that." "No," he said, "but I can promise to be standing right here with you." The courthouse doors creaked open. A clerk looked them over, taking in their dusty clothes and tired faces. "We need to see a judge," Nettie said, her voice firm, "before a lawyer named Emmett Slade can." The clerk noticed her bandaged wrists and the journal she held tight. He saw the three people standing behind her like a fortress. "Come on inside," he said. He led them to a waiting room. The clerk's name was Howard Marsh. He told them Judge Arthur Waverly would see them soon. "Has anyone else filed this morning?" Nettie asked. Marsh shifted his feet. A Mr. Slade filed a competency review yesterday afternoon. It is on the docket for Thursday. Nettie looked at Josiah. He filed it before we even left town. He planned all of it. The clerk left them alone in the quiet room. Nettie opened her mother's journal to the very last page. "What does it say?" Levi asked. Her voice was steady as she read the words aloud. April 14th, 1874. Harlan came home at 3 in the morning. He told me if I ever tried to leave, he would make sure Nettie never left either. I believe him. She closed the book. "That was 4 years ago," she said. "My mother died 6 months later." The door opened and Judge Arthur Waverly walked in. He was a man of about 50 with eyes that didn't mess around. He held a file in his hand. "I've read Mr. Slade's motion. Now I want to hear your side of the story." "MTT Slade on behalf of Harlan Calloway," Waverly said, sitting down without so much as a howdy. "And I've got 4 people from Abilene who rode all night to get here. Somebody tell me why you should go first." Nettie got to her feet. "Because that competency motion is a bald-faced lie, Your Honor. My father filed it to keep me from talking about how he forced me to sign over our property. He locked me in a root cellar for 47 days. I have my mother's journal telling about years of his abuse, 3 sworn statements from witnesses, and the rope burns on my wrists to prove every last word." The judge looked at her wrists, then at the papers, then right into her eyes. "Sit down, Miss Calloway. Tell me everything. From the very beginning." Nettie sat. She talked for 30 solid minutes. No tears, no shaky voice. Just the cold, hard facts, laid out plain as day. The kind of facts you learn by heart when you're trapped in the dark for 47 days with nothing else to do. Waverly read the journal entries Nettie pointed out. He read every statement. When he finished, he closed the book and looked at Nettie. "This list of his debts, how in the world did you put this together?" "My father talked to himself when he drank. He sat right over the cellar most nights, going through his money troubles out loud. I memorized it all. You memorized amounts and names while you were locked underground. I had 47 days with nothing to do but listen and remember." Waverly leaned back. "Miss Calloway, I'm going to be blunt. Mr. Slade's motion says you're suffering from melancholy and ain't fit to manage your own affairs. It's backed up by a paper from a Dr. Franklin Poole in Salina, who says you show signs of mental instability, all based on what your father told him. That doctor has never even laid eyes on me, I'm aware. He put that in his statement. And he's willing to call you incompetent on the word of the man who locked you in a cellar." Waverly's jaw went tight. "The law allows family testimony in these things. It's a part of the law I've never cared for. But there it is." "Then you examine me," Nettie said, leaning forward. "Right here, right now. Ask me anything. Test my mind. If I'm not competent, you'll see it for yourself. And if I am, then that doctor's paper's just a bought and paid for opinion." The room got quiet. Judge Waverly looked at her for a long time. Then he turned to his clerk. "Go get Dr. Harmon. Tell him I need an independent examination. Today." "Your Honor," the clerk started. "Today, Howard." The clerk left. Waverly stood. "We're in recess until Dr. Harmon gets here. Miss Calloway, you and your people will wait in this building. Mr. Slade is due in my court at 2 o'clock for something else. I reckon he'll find out you're here. Y'all be ready for that." He walked out and the door closed. Nettie finally let out a breath. It was the first time Josiah had seen her relax one bit since he found her in that cellar. "You did real good," Maeve said. "I just did what my mother would have. She never got the chance." Levi stood watching the street from the window. "Someone's coming. A man in a suit, walking fast." "Slade," Nettie said, not even looking. Sure enough, 2 minutes later, the door flew open. EMIT Slade strutted in like he owned the place. But right behind him was Harlan Calloway himself. Nettie shot up from her chair. Josiah was by her side in a second. Maeve stepped up. Levi turned from the window. "Miss Calloway," Slade said, all smooth-like. "What a surprise." "Get him out of here," Nettie said, her eyes fixed on her father. "Judge Pewitt gave me a restraining order. He can't be within 100 feet of me. That order's for Dickinson County, Slade shot back. We're in Selland County, different jurisdiction. That's just a technicality. The law is made of technicalities, Miss Calloway. Harlan hadn't said a word. He just stood there, all cleaned up and sober, wearing his good coat again. He looked at Nettie with a face that tried to look sad. Nettie, he started. I just want to speak. You had 47 days and chose to lock a door. I was trying to protect you. You were trying to rob me blind. Slade raised a hand. Mr. Calloway, I'll take it from here. Miss Calloway, your father is willing to make a deal. He'll drop this competency business and forget the water rights if you'll return the land deed and any notion of criminal charges. The room got still as a church. He wants the land back, Nettie said, her voice low. And to act like this never happened. He wants to settle this quietly as a family, Slade said. Without the expense of a trial. You mean without him facing what he did? Slade just shrugged. Courts decide consequences. I'm offering you peace. Nettie looked straight at her father. Is that what you want, Father? Peace? Harlan's face twisted. I want my little girl back. You never lost me. You put me in a cage. There is a big difference. I made a bad choice. You chained me to a wall. I was drinking. I wasn't thinking straight. You were your truest self. The whiskey just washed away the act. Harlan's control finally snapped, his eyes getting watery. Your mother would have wanted us to fix this. The warmth left Nettie's face in a flash. Don't you speak her name. She wrote about you. Every night you stumbled home drunk, every fist, every threat. She kept a journal hidden under my floor because she knew you'd burn it. She trusted I'd find it when the time was right. You never knew her. You just owned her, and when she passed, you figured you owned me, too. Harlan stumbled back as if she'd struck him. Slade stepped right in. Miss Calloway, getting emotional won't play well with Judge Waverly. That wasn't emotion, Mr. Slade. That was my sworn testimony. Just then, the door opened. Judge Waverly walked in, trailed by an older doctor with a medical bag. Dr. William Harmon, the most respected physician in Salina. The judge looked around. Mr. Slade, I don't recall sending for you. I heard my client's daughter was here. I came to help find a solution. You came to scare a witness inside my courthouse. Mr. Calloway, a restraining order is in place. I don't give a damn which county signed it. You will wait outside or I'll have you removed. Your Honor, Slade started. Now. Harlan gave Nettie one last look before he turned and left. Slade paused at the door. The offer is still good. No, Nettie said firmly, it's not. After Slade was gone, Waverly shut the door. Doctor, I need a full mental competency evaluation for Miss Calloway. Be thorough. I want your honest opinion. I don't give any other kind, Arthur, Harmon said. He faced Nettie. Miss Calloway, would you rather we did this in private? No, I want everyone here to listen. I want it on the official record. Harmon nodded, sitting across from her. For the next hour, he tested her memory, her logic, her state of mind. He had her recall passages from the journal and explain the water rights dispute. He made her count backward from 100 by sevens. He asked about the difference between sadness and true despair. Nettie answered every question with a calm, steady strength. When he was done, Harmon stood up and faced the judge. This woman is not mentally unfit. She suffers from no ailment that would cloud her reason. In my professional view, she has one of the clearest minds I have seen all year. And whoever signed that affidavit ought to be ashamed. Waverly gave a short nod. Thank you, Doctor. It will be recorded as such. Arthur, that young woman spent 47 days locked underground. She doesn't need a hearing. She needs justice for the man who put her there. Harmon tipped his hat to Nettie and departed. Waverly took his seat at the head of the table and folded his hands. Miss Calloway, considering the evidence, which includes your mother's journal, 3 witness statements, and Dr. Harmon's findings, I am issuing a few orders. First, the competency motion is thrown out. Second, the deed for the 40 acres south of the river is void, as it was signed under threat. Third, the water rights filed by your mother remain in your name. Fourth, I'm passing this whole matter of your false imprisonment to the U.S. Marshal's Office for a criminal investigation. And my father? Nettie asked. He will be arrested, Miss Calloway. The wheels of justice turn slow, but they do turn. Nettie closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them, they were clear. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me, thank your mother. She built this case from beyond the grave. You just carried it here. The judge gathered his papers and left. Maeve was the first one to move. She wrapped her arms around Nettie, who just stood there letting herself be held. Your mother would be so proud, Maeve whispered. My mother would be mad. It took so long, Nettie whispered back. Josiah and Levi stood near the door, quiet and watchful. Some things don't need words from men, just their presence. When Maeve let go, Nettie straightened up, clutching the journal to her chest. We should head home, she said. To Abilene? Levi asked. To Josiah's place, for now. She looked at Josiah. If your offer still stands. It does. They stepped out of the courthouse into the bright sun. Slade was across the street, just watching them. Harlan was gone. Slade saw them load the wagon, but didn't move or say a word. He'll fight this, Nettie said as Josiah helped her up. Let him. He'll find some other scheme or some other doctor. We'll be ready for him. Nettie looked down at him. You really believe that? I believe I saw you make a judge listen. I believe you bested a lawyer twice your age, and I believe your mother knew her daughter was strong enough to see this through. Josiah climbed up next to her. Yeah, I believe it. They headed west out of Salina. Maeve and Levi followed the wagon. Nettie sat beside Josiah, the journal resting in her lap. About halfway home, Levi rode up beside them. Rider coming our way. Josiah's hand went to his rifle, but Nettie stopped him. Wait. The rider got closer. It was a man with a star pinned to his vest. Deputy U.S. Marshal James Beckett, out of Topeka. Judge Waverly sent word. I'm on my way to Abilene with an arrest warrant for Harlan Calloway. Nettie's grip on the journal tightened. He gets dangerous when he's backed into a corner. Most men do, ma'am. That's why they sent me instead of a telegram. Beckett looked over at Josiah. You must be Josiah Crane. Waverly said you opened a door. That's all I did. Beckett almost cracked a smile. Sometimes that's all it takes. He tipped his hat and rode on past them toward Abilene, leaving a trail of dust. Nettie watched him go, and her shoulders fell just a little. It was the first quiet breath of a woman who was starting to believe that the locked door was finally going to stay open for good. Josiah, she said softly. Yes, ma'am? Thank you for opening that door. He just nodded and drove the wagon on, heading west toward home, while the Kansas sun beat down on them. Back in Abilene, Marshal Beckett had already made his move. Pete Holm came riding hard to catch up with Josiah's wagon. The marshal arrested Harlan, Pete said, all out of breath. But it wasn't easy. Nettie sat bolt upright. What happened? Harlan locked himself in the house. The marshal gave him an hour. When the time was up, Harlan came out the front door holding a rifle. Josiah pulled the wagon to a halt. Did he shoot? No, sir. He put the rifle down and got on his knees. But he was yelling the whole time, telling anyone who would listen that his daughter was a thief and a liar, and that Josiah Crane had stolen her away for the land. And did folks listen? Maeve asked. Pete shifted in his saddle. Some did. A few fellas from the saloon were nodding along. But then Mrs. Aldrich came right out of her house. She walked straight up to Harlan as the marshal was cuffing him and said loud and clear, I heard her screaming for 47 nights. You can go on and call me a liar, too. Well, the whole street went quiet after that. Nettie closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked different, settled. Where is he now? In jail. The marshal's holding him for the Federals in Topeka. Briggs tried to intervene, said it was a county matter. The marshal told him to step aside or he'd be joining Harlan in that cell. And Briggs tucked his tail and left. After Pete rode on, nobody said much for a long while. As they got close to the ranch, Nettie finally spoke. He'll try to get a message to me. He'll say he's sorry, that he needs me. You don't have to answer, Josiah said quietly. I know. But I have to decide what I'll do. Because a part of me, she paused, her jaw tight. A part of me still remembers the father he was. Before the war, before the whiskey. He used to carry me on his shoulders down to the river. He taught me how to ride. He built me a shelf for my books. Her voice caught just for a second. The man who locked me in that cellar ain't the same man who built me that shelf. But they live in the same skin, and I don't know how to hate one without hating the other. Josiah didn't offer easy words. He knew better. Time hadn't healed him after he lost Sarah. It just taught him how to carry the weight. You don't have to figure all that out tonight, he said. I know, but I've had 47 days of nothing but thinking, and I still don't have an answer. They reached the ranch well after dark. Josiah helped Nettie down from the wagon seat. For a few minutes, they all just moved through the chores, bodies knowing the work, even if their minds were a long way off. Maeve put coffee on. They sat on the porch, all four of them, drinking in the dark. Nettie stared out at the road. There's something I have to do tomorrow, she said. What's that? Maeve asked. I'm going back to the house, my mother's house. Nettie. Not to see him. He's in jail. I have to go back because I've been running from that place for 47 days. If I don't walk through that door on my own terms, it'll own me, just like he did. No one argued. Josiah just nodded. Maeve reached over and squeezed her hand. Levi set his cup down, a look on his face that said he'd be right there with her. I'll go by myself, Nettie said. No, you won't, all three of them said at once. A small, rough laugh escaped Nettie's lips. It sounded like something that had been locked up even longer than she had. All right, but I go in first. Alone. The next morning, they rode out. They stopped at the fence, and Nettie went on by herself. She got off her horse and walked to the front door. She stood there for a good minute, her hand on the knob. Then she pushed it open and walked right inside. She was in there for what felt like 20 long minutes of held breath. When it was over, Nettie walked out of that house for the last time. In her hands, she carried a small wooden box. My mother's things, she said, letters, a locket, and the original deed to the water rights. She sewed it into the lining of her winter coat. Maeve looked stunned. She hid the deed in a coat? Nettie nodded. My mother hid everything right out in the open. It looked like she was just keeping house, but she was really building an arsenal. She turned away from the house and didn't look back. I want to go home, she said, then corrected herself. I mean, to your ranch. You have a home, Josiah said, for as long as you need one. 2 days later, a deputy marshal named Beckett came to the ranch. He sat on the porch and laid out the facts. Your father is being taken to Topeka to face federal charges. Judge Waverly has voided the deed transfer. The water rights are yours. Sheriff Briggs has resigned and Judge Pwitt has appointed a replacement. Slade withdrew from the case this morning. He filed a notice and left town on the noon stage. It seems that representing a man who chains up his daughter is bad for business. What about the doctor who signed the paper? Judge Waverly sent the matter to the state medical board. Dr. Poole's license is being reviewed. Nettie nodded. So it is over. The legal fight is, Beckett said. The rest is for you to figure out, Miss Calloway. He tipped his hat and rode away. Nettie turned to Josiah. He is right. The law has done its part. But I do not know what to do next. What do you want to do? She thought for a long moment, slowly, like someone who finally had time. I want to rebuild my mother's house, fix the fences, plant her garden again, make it beautiful the way it was when she was alive. That is a lot of work. I know how to work. I know you do. And I want to use the water rights the way my mother wanted, not for money, but for the ranches downstream. Fair access for everyone, the way it ought to be. I'm doing it because my mother filed for those water rights to protect this town, and my father tried to use them as a weapon. I am just putting things right. The next week was filled with hard work and quiet days. Nettie spent her time fixing up her mother's old place, mending fences, and clearing out the garden. She worked from sunup to sundown, not with desperation, but with a real sense of purpose. Levi rode out from town every other day with supplies. He would stay and help with the heavy lifting. He was a man of few words while they worked, but on their breaks, he would ask her small, patient questions about the ranch and her mother. One afternoon, as they were fixing the chicken coop, Nettie finally asked him, "Why do you keep coming all the way out here?" Levi put his hammer down. "Because you need the help. Plenty of folks need help. You do not ride 2 hours for all of them." He looked her straight in the eye. "No," he said softly, "I do not." Something unspoken passed between them. Nettie was the first to look away, a small smile playing on her lips. "Hand me that board, will you?" He passed her the piece of lumber. Their fingers brushed for just a second. Neither one of them said a word about it, but Levi stayed an hour later than usual that day. And when he finally rode off, Nettie stood and watched him go for a lot longer than a woman watches a man she is not thinking about. And Maeve saw it all. Of course she did. Maeve brought a basket of supper over one evening, sitting with Nettie on the porch while Josiah saw to the horses. "My son has taken a shine to you," Maeve said plainly. "I know." "Well, do you like him?" For Nettie, no question was ever that simple. "That is not an answer," Maeve prodded gently. Nettie worried a loose thread on her sleeve. "He is a good man." He stared down a shotgun without flinching. "He rode all night to Selena for me. He comes out here every couple of days and asks for nothing in return." "That is a list of his deeds," Maeve said, "not your feelings." Nettie was quiet for a long moment. "It feels like I spent 4 years in the dark, and he is the first person who did not try to be the sun. He just stood nearby with a lantern and let me find my own way out." A smile bloomed on Maeve's face. "That is the finest thing anyone has ever said about my boy." Nettie finally let out a real warm laugh. A month later, a letter showed up, addressed in her father's hand. She sat on her porch in her house and held it for a full hour. Josiah offered to stay, but she told him she had to do this part alone. The letter was short. Harlan's handwriting was shakier than she remembered. He wrote that he was sorry, that the drink had taken him somewhere he never meant to go. He wrote that he remembered building a shelf for her books. He said he did not expect forgiveness, only that he wanted her to know that the father who built that shelf was still in there, and he was ashamed. Nettie read it twice. She did not cry. She did not rip it to shreds. She simply folded it and put it in the wooden box with her mother's keepsakes. When Josiah came back to the porch, she looked up and said, "He says he is sorry. Do you believe him?" "I believe he means it today. I do not know if today is enough, but I believe him for now." She closed the box. Fall came on early that year, and Nettie's garden produced its first harvest. She brought a basket of tomatoes and squash to Maeve, who wordlessly pulled her into a long, warm hug. Judge Pwitt stopped by the ranch one afternoon. He sat with them and said Harlan had pleaded guilty up in Topeka. He got 5 years. Slade's legal games were officially tossed out, and the water rights were filed in Nettie's name, permanent and uncontested. "Your mother would have been proud of you," Judge Pwitt said. "I know," Nettie replied. "I just wish she was here to see it." The judge gave a solemn nod. He understood a sorrow that time could not soften, and his silence was the perfect reply. Levi came for supper that night, a habit he had picked up most nights. He brought firewood, and Nettie made stew. After they ate, Josiah made a quiet excuse to check the horses, leaving the two of them alone in the cooling air. "I have something to ask you," Levi said. "Then ask. There is a harvest dance in town next Saturday. Would you go with me?" "Yes." I did not even finish asking. "You did not have to." They both grinned. Sitting on that porch, with her own garden growing and a warm stove inside, Nettie Calloway felt something she had not felt in 4 long years. It was not safety, she had found that with Josiah. It was not justice, she had found that in a courtroom. It was not even love, though she reckoned that was coming, slow and steady as the man beside her. It was freedom. Not the desperate freedom of running, but the quiet, solid freedom of choosing to stay, and knowing the door at her back now opened both ways. He thought of Nettie's 47 marks cut into that cellar post, a girl who refused to be forgotten. He remembered setting out for simple fencing wire and ending up in a fight that had to be won. Maeve had seen it in him from the get-go, telling him, "You're not the kind of man who can look away." And she was right. He was mighty glad for it. At the harvest dance, Nettie was a picture in a blue cotton dress. Levi, his boots shined so you could see your face in them, swung her around the floor. She stumbled on his feet, but he just smiled wider. Mrs. Aldrich watched them from her chair, tears of pure joy tracking down her cheeks. Josiah stood back, just taking it all in, when Maeve came to stand beside him. "You did a real good thing, Josiah Crane," she said. He just shook his head. "All I did was open a door." "Sometimes," she replied. "That's the best thing a fella can do." Music played on, and Nettie's laugh echoed through the hall, a sound they had not heard in years. Miles off in a Topeka jail cell, Harlan Calloway sat in the crushing silence, counting his own days. But Nettie was done with counting. That cellar post was in the past. The life waiting for her was her own, earned one hard day at a time. If this story spoke to you, we would sure appreciate it if you would like this video and subscribe to our channel. Tell us in the comments what part stuck with you the most. We retell every story with care, and the images are created to help you feel it. If you enjoy this kind of story, stick around with us. There is another one coming, and it might just be the one to remind you that it only takes opening a single door to stop counting the marks for good. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.